an issue that affects millions of hardworking Americans, especially those in our restaurants, bars, hotels, tipped workers. These workers are the face of the American economy, linking our citizens with the goods and services on which their lives depend. Their livelihoods depend not only on the tips they earn, but also on the policies that govern their pay. Unfortunately, a misguided Biden-Harris administration rule is putting their jobs and wages at risk. Under the Fair Labor Standards Act, there's a system in place that's been around for decades. It's called the tip credit. It allows employers to count a portion of an employee's tips towards the minimum wage. This system, it's worked for years. It's allowed tipped employees to be paid a base wage that's less than the federal standard as long as their combined earning with tips exceeds the federal minimum wage. It's common sense, and it helps the workers because most tipped workers earn far more than the federal minimum wage. A recent study by the National Restaurant Association found that the median tipped worker earns $27 an hour, and that's not an anomaly, it's the norm. The current system gives tipped workers the opportunity to thrive, and it doesn't just help them, it helps the restaurants and small businesses that employ them. Unfortunately, across the country, we're seeing anti-worker policies that phase out the tip credit altogether. In Seattle, for instance, raising the base wage for tipped employees led to job losses. One Seattle-based restaurant server said, "We need to have some balance here because right now we're losing jobs, we're losing hours, we're losing tipped income, and it's not good." I'm grateful to have that worker here today to testify. There are over 4 million Americans working in tipped occupations, and they're telling us very clearly, don't take away the tip credit. In a recent survey, 90% of tipped employees said they prefer the current system, and 87% are afraid that if their employers are forced to pay a higher base wage without counting tips, their earnings will go down. These workers are telling us the economic reality of their workplaces, and we should listen to them. Sadly, the Biden-Harris administration hasn't listened. The Department of Labor's 2021 tip rule restricts the tip credit drastically. What's more, if an employee spends just 30 minutes on duties that don't produce tips, the employer can no longer claim the tip credit at all. It's essentially a requirement on small businesses to track their employees' every movement, minute by minute. It's burdensome, invasive, and altogether out of touch with the realities of working life. Fortunately, just last month, we saw a major victory for common sense. The U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit struck down the 2021 tip rule, calling it contrary to the Fair Labor Standards Act. This ruling was a win for both workers and small businesses, but the fight is far from over. This committee is dedicated to supporting workers, small businesses, and the customers who rely on them. The tip credit benefits all three. It provides flexibility for businesses, ensures tipped workers earn more, and helps maintain a thriving service industry. With that, I look forward to the testimony of our esteemed witnesses and yield to the ranking member for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also want to thank the witnesses for joining us today. In one of the richest countries in the world, no one working full-time should be living in poverty. Yet sadly, that is the reality for millions of low-wage workers in this country. Currently, under the Fair Labor Standards Act, an employer may pay a tipped employee a sub-minimum wage of no less than $2.13 per hour and use the employee's tips to meet the employer's obligation to pay the federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour. However, the sub-minimum wage results in lower pay, more uncertainty, and higher poverty rates for tipped workers than for non-tipped workers. Through error or outright wage theft, employers too often fail to ensure that their workers are making the full minimum wage. According to a 2014 report by the White House National Economic Council and the Department of Labor, more than 1 in 10 surveyed workers in predominantly tipped occupations report that they received hourly wages, including tips, below the federal minimum wage. And while my Republican colleagues may point to a handful of of high-earning tipped workers as evidence of the system's success, we must confront the reality of most tipped employees. Tipped workers are unfortunately paid less per hour than non-tipped workers, and they have less access to benefits such as paid sick leave, health care, short-term disability, life insurance, and paid vacation. Now, these workers face systemic challenges and often suffer from inadequate pay and rampant abuse. And the conditions for tipped workers under the Trump administration were even worse. In addition to the fact that roughly half of all jobs in the leisure and hospitality sectors were lost between February and April of 2020, the Trump Department of Labor pushed to allow low-road employers to steal tipped workers' hard-earned pay. For example, the Trump-era tip rule would have allowed employers to take the tips that tipped workers earn and share them with untipped workers and managers as long as the employers pay at least $7.25 per hour and do not take a tip credit. In practice, the rule would allow employers to steal tipped workers' wages to line their own pockets or subsidize the wages of their non-tipped staff. According to a 2017 report from the Economic Policy Institute, this rule would have resulted in an estimated $5.8 billion in stolen wages from tipped workers annually. And so as we look ahead, it's clear that Republicans are laying the groundwork for Project 2025, which threatens to further erode the protections that workers rely on. In stark contrast, congressional Democrats are committed to advancing legislation that will lift millions of hardworking Americans out of poverty and hold unscrupulous employers accountable. The Raise the Wage Act would gradually increase the federal minimum wage to $17 per hour and phase out all sub-minimum wages. And the Let's Protect Workers Act would hold employers accountable by closing loopholes and enforcing penalties for those who neglect worker safety and fair compensation. Our economy, our communities, and our country are stronger when we reward and support hardworking families. Congressional Democrats are committed to raising workers' standards of living through policies like expanding access to affordable child care, overtime pay, and paid time off to take care of loved ones, and ensuring workers can stand together and negotiate for better wages and benefits. And so as we proceed with today's hearing, let us remember the real faces and stories behind these statistics. Let us work together to build a system that supports and protects all workers. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Pursuant to Committee Rule 8C, all committee members who wish to insert written statements into the record may do so by submitting them to the committee clerk electronically in Microsoft Word format by 5 p.m. after 14 days from the date of this hearing, which is October 2nd, 2024. And without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 14 days after the date of this hearing to allow such statements and other extraneous material referenced during the hearing to be submitted for the official hearing record. I note for the subcommittee that some of my colleagues who are not permanent members of this subcommittee may be waving on for the purpose of today's hearing. I will now turn to the introduction of our distinguished witnesses. Our first witness today is Mr. Tom Boucher, who is the owner of Great New Hampshire Restaurants Incorporated, which is located in Bedford, New Hampshire, and who is testifying on behalf of the National Restaurant Association. Our second witness is Mr. Paul DeCamp, who is member of Epstein, Becker, and Green, PC, located in Washington, D.C., and is a practicing wage and hour attorney. Our third witness is Ms. Saru Jayaraman, who is president of One Fair Wage in New York, New York. And our final witness is Ms. Simone Barron, who is co-founder of Full Service Workers Alliance in Seattle, Washington. We thank the witnesses for being here today, and we look forward to your testimony. Pursuant to committee rules, I would like to ask each of you to limit your oral presentation to the 5-minute summary of your written statement. I would also like to remind witnesses to be aware of their responsibility to provide accurate information to the subcommittee. I will first recognize Mr. Boucher.
Thank you, Chairman Kiley, Ranking Member Adams, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Tom Boucher, and I am the CEO and owner of Great New Hampshire Restaurants. What began as one small restaurant in 1984 has grown into 9 locations, employing 800 people and serving over 2 million guests annually. I'm proud to say that we're celebrating our 40th anniversary this year. In 1987, I started as a server at T-Bone's, learning every aspect of the business from the ground up. This is not just my story, it's the story of thousands in our industry. The restaurant industry is unique because it provides upward mobility, offering opportunities for anyone, regardless of background, to start in entry-level positions and build lasting careers through hard work and dedication. Over 60% of Americans have worked in a restaurant. 8 out of 10 restaurant owners, including myself, started in those same roles. The restaurant industry doesn't just provide jobs, it provides a path to success, offering opportunities for personal growth, financial independence, and entrepreneurship. That said, running a restaurant is not easy. Margins are razor thin, and well-meaning legislation or regulation, if it doesn't account for the realities of our industry, can have serious unintended consequences. And today, I want to focus on 2 key issues affecting the restaurants and their employees: the tip credit and the Department of Labor's 80-20-30 rule. The tip credit is vital to restaurants like mine. It allows employees to earn significantly more than the federal minimum wage while helping restaurants manage labor costs. At my restaurant, servers consistently earn $20 and $30 an hour, with some earning even more. No tip server makes less than minimum wage, and they are protected by the federal law to ensure that. Our employees understand how important the tip credit is to their livelihoods. In fact, some of my employees launched a campaign called WeLikeOurTips.com to voice their support for keeping the tip credit intact. They know that eliminating the tip credit would limit their earning potential. We've already seen what happens when tip credit is removed. In New Hampshire, 2 restaurants switched to a flat hourly wage model, and their servers left for other restaurants where they could earn more through tips. Both businesses eventually closed. The very workers these policies are meant to help end up losing out. Here in Washington, D.C., nearly 1,000 restaurant jobs have been lost after voters passed Initiative 82 to phase out the tip credit. Our survey found that 86% of local restaurant operators believe rising tip minimum wage harms their operations, leading to increased prices, reduced staffs, and closures. These are real-world outcomes of policies that do not consider the unique needs of the restaurant industry. Without the tip credit, labor costs for restaurant operators would skyrocket. We'd be forced to substantially raise prices, cut hours, or in the worst case, shut down. The ripple effect would hurt local farmers, suppliers, and other businesses. When restaurants close, the entire local economy suffers. In addition to preserving the tip credit, I'd like to address the Department of Labor's 80-20-30 rule. This rule restricted the amount of time tipped employees could spend on non-tip tasks, creating unrealistic and unnecessary burdens. In the fast-paced world of restaurants, employees often switch tasks, as we call it, on the fly. A server might reset tables, restock items, or roll silverware, all part of ensuring the best possible customer experience. Tracking and limiting these tasks was just not practical. It was impossible. Thankfully, the Fifth Circuit of Appeals struck the rule down, recognizing that it did not reflect the realities of the industry. But we need to ensure that this kind of burden doesn't return. That's why we support H.R. 1612, the Tipped Employee Protection Act, to prevent the reintroduction of a similar rule. Chairman Kiley, Ranking Member Adams, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you again for the opportunity to speak with you today. In conclusion, I want to emphasize that the decisions made here have real-world consequences. The restaurant industry is a cornerstone of local economies, providing jobs, fostering community engagement, and offering pathways to economic mobility and personal success. The success of restaurants like mine depends on policies that allow us to operate substantially and contribute to the local and national economy. Eliminating the tip credit or reinstating rigid rules like the 80-20-30 rule would hurt employees, small business owners, and the communities that rely on us. I urge you to carefully consider the broader impact of these policies and protect the flexibility and structure that allows the restaurant industry to thrive. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Mr. Boucher. I will next recognize Mr. DeCamp.
Good morning, Chairman Kiley, Ranking Member Adams, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify at this hearing to discuss tipped workers. The Fair Labor Standards Act sets forth the federal requirements regarding minimum wage, overtime, and child labor. For most workers, the income from their job consists primarily or entirely of wages paid by their employer. But some jobs involve a second, often substantial source of income in addition to employer-paid wages, tips from customers, clients, or patrons. For nearly 60 years, the law has recognized a concept known as the tip credit, which allows employers in certain circumstances to count a portion of the tips their employees receive as satisfying the minimum wage while paying a lower direct wage. In essence, the tip credit acknowledges the reality that from the standpoint of ensuring that workers have the protections of the minimum wage, someone who receives $7.25 per hour directly from her employer is on an equal economic footing with someone who receives at least that same amount in direct wages and tips combined. In the late 1970s, the Department of Labor began parsing the various tasks restaurant servers, bartenders, and other employees perform, trying to identify situations where the department believed that the employer should not be able to take the tip credit. This activity culminated in 1988 with the department's so-called 80-20 rule, an enforcement policy under which, in general terms, employers lose the ability to take the tip credit for tasks that do not directly and immediately produce tips if the employee spends more than 20% of the work week on those activities. Nearly every court that considered the issue deferred to the department's view, applying both Chevron deference and the Supreme Court's ruling in Auer against Robbins. Beginning in 2009, the department, under 4 successive administrations, reversed the policy on 80-20 taken by the previous administration. In 2021, the current administration issued a regulation codifying the 80-20 principle, along with the new concept that an employer may not take the tip credit if a worker spends more than 30 continuous minutes on tasks that do not generate tips. 2 trade associations challenged the 2021 final rule in court. After oral argument before the United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit, but before the court issued its decision, the Supreme Court handed down its ruling in Loper Bright Enterprises against Raimondo, which overruled Chevron. Now, instead of deferring to an agency's preferred interpretation of a statute at the first sign of textual ambiguity, as had been the case for the past 40 years, courts considering the validity of a regulation must independently discern the meaning of the statute using all the available tools of statutory construction. Late last month, the Fifth Circuit issued its decision in Restaurant Law Center against Department of Labor. Applying Loper Bright, the court concluded that the 2021 regulation fails under the Administrative Procedure Act, both because it conflicts with the text of the FLSA and because it is arbitrary and capricious. The Fifth Circuit emphasized that the statute focuses on an employee's occupation, not how much time she spends pursuing tips. The court then vacated the regulation. H.R. 1612, the Tipped Employee Protection Act, would amend the FLSA in a way that is in line with the Fifth Circuit's recent ruling. The bill clarifies that the tip credit is available so long as an employee receives sufficient tips and hourly earnings to satisfy minimum wage. This approach is entirely consistent with the historical purpose of the tip credit, ensuring that tipped employees are no worse off than non-tipped employees with respect to the protections of the federal minimum wage. In recent years, there have been various executive and legislative efforts to eliminate the tip credit, which would require employers to pay tipped employees the full minimum wage. These efforts are, in my view, misguided for several reasons. First, tipped workers currently have total earnings, including tips, that average $15.51 per hour, which is more than double the minimum wage. Second, when given the choice of receiving tips along with a wage subject to the tip credit, or else an all-in menu pricing concept with no tipping, 97% of tipped employees prefer the ability to receive tips. Third, customers overwhelmingly prefer the option of tipping to having that choice taken away from them. Fourth, roughly 3 in 4 American labor economists agree that reducing the tip credit leads to a loss of jobs in service industries. Finally, economic data show that reducing or eliminating the tip credit does not lead to an increase in employees' weekly earnings. The current tipping system, including the tip credit, does not hurt workers, it helps them. Eliminating the tip credit would benefit neither workers nor consumers. The FLSA enables tipped employees to achieve substantial earnings, and we should continue to allow the law to do its work. This concludes my prepared remarks. I welcome any questions the members of the subcommittee may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. DeCamp. I will now recognize Ms. Jayaraman.
Jayaraman. Good morning. My name is Saru Jayaraman. I'm the co-founder and president of One Fair Wage. I'm also the director of the Food Labor Research Center at the University of California, Berkeley. For the last 22 years, we have spent actually thousands and thousands of hours collecting surveys from tens of thousands of restaurant workers and tipped workers across the country. And they have overwhelmingly told us, after decades, that their top concern is their wages, which makes sense, knowing that the restaurant industry is by far the absolute lowest paying employer in the United States of America. Every year, the U.S. Department of Labor puts out a list of the 10 lowest paying jobs. 7 of the 10 are in the restaurant industry. In fact, the 7 lowest paying, and 4 of the 7 are tipped occupations, even when you take tips into account. And that is because the wage structure in the restaurant industry dates back to emancipation. Prior to emancipation, waiters in the United States were mostly white males. They actually received a full wage, no tips. After emancipation, restaurants sought the ability to hire newly freed Black people, Black women in particular, not pay them a wage, and force them to live entirely on a new concept that had just come from Europe. Now, in Europe, tips were always on top of a wage, never instead of a wage. It was emancipation and Jim Crow America that allowed restaurants to change the concept of tipping for the first time in world history from being an extra or bonus on top of a wage to becoming the entirety of the wage itself. And that became law in 1938 as part of the New Deal and is the origin of the subminimum wage for tipped workers, which is a ridiculous $2.13 an hour today. Today, still, 160 years later since emancipation, tipped workers are overwhelmingly women, disproportionately women of color, more than 2/3 women. They are largely women working in very casual restaurants and bars across the country. Their median wage, including tips, according to the American Community Survey, is $15,000. That is including tips, and that is an average of $7.40 an hour, including tips. That is a median, meaning half of the workers earn less. That has resulted in an enormous amount of economic instability. It results in the fact that tipped workers suffer from 3 times the poverty rate of other workers, use food stamps at double the rate of other workers, and have the highest levels of wage theft of any industry in the United States, according to the U.S. Department of Labor and every Department of Labor in the United States. There are 7 states that have done it differently for decades: California, Oregon, Washington, Nevada, Minnesota, Montana, and Alaska. And today, we bring findings looking at the last couple of years since the pandemic, comparing the 7 states that have had a full minimum wage to the 43 states that have not. And the 7 states have outperformed the 43 states on every measure. They've outperformed the 43 states in terms of restaurant establishment growth, higher in the 7 states since the pandemic. They've outpaced the 43 states with a subminimum wage in terms of employment growth in restaurants. And they've outpaced the 43 states in terms of wages, including tips. Washington State, where Ms. Barron is from, has actually outpaced all 43 states according to the National Restaurant Association's data itself. Washington State has outpaced other states in terms of establishment growth and employment growth. So the 7 states are doing well. They provide a full minimum wage with tips on top. Tipping is robust in those states. It's the same or higher as it is in the 43 states with the subminimum wage for tipped workers. The pandemic made this disparity between the states much worse. With the pandemic, workers reported that their tips went down, harassment went up. 2/3 of tipped workers reported that they couldn't get unemployment insurance because in most states they were told their wages were too low to qualify for benefits. And with the extreme amounts of both tip reduction and harassment increase, 1.2 million restaurant workers walked off the job, saying 70% reported that we are leaving because we no longer can put up with the low wages in this industry. As a result, we've tracked thousands of restaurants across the country that have raised wages, in fact, to the full minimum wage and higher with tips on top in order to recruit and retain staff. There is no better data to show that workers want this than the fact that they left the industry in droves, saying they cannot tolerate the wage structure in the industry any longer. And it is why workers have been winning wage increases in city after city, state after state. It is why it is moving with so much momentum right now, and why we're having this hearing today.
Thank you. And finally, I will recognize Ms. Barron.
Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Kiley and Ranking Member Adams, for the opportunity to testify. My name is Simone Barron, and I've been a tipped worker in the full-service restaurant industry for 36 years. I have worked in several cities across the country, including Indianapolis and Chicago, but I'm coming to you today from Seattle, Washington, where I've been a tipped worker for the past 24 years. Washington State eliminated its tip credit in the 1980s, and in 2014, when Seattle passed the 15 Now wage law, I was making nearly $10 an hour plus tips. As of today, the rates are $19.97 per hour for the largest operators and $17.25 per hour for the smallest. These rates are set to increase to over $20 per hour for both large and small operators on January 1st, 2025. I wish I were coming to you today to say that our former council member, Kshama Sawant, who championed the 15 Now movement, was correct in her statement that $15 an hour would lift 100,000 workers out of poverty. I wish I was bringing you better news today to say that this has all worked out somehow and that I'm living better than ever before, but I can't. The minimum wage hike in Seattle is devastating my industry, my job, and my income. Seattle is approaching its 11th consecutive wage hike since the wage law went into effect. We didn't even stop raising the wage during the COVID pandemic. Since the mandatory wage hike started, hundreds of restaurants have closed or moved out of the area. Those that remain are forced to reinvent the wheel by changing how they do business. As the wage hike without a tip credit has gradually eroded our industry, workers like myself have been subject to surcharges, service charges, non-transparent pay models, elimination of tip lines, elimination of tipping, mandatory tip pooling to pay non-tipped workers, thank you, Patty Murray, elimination of support staff jobs, elimination of hours and shifts, and in many cases, loss of jobs as restaurants have closed. The looming hike on January 1, 2025 promises to bring more of the same, with the expectation of more layoffs, rising costs and menu prices, and even more closures. And what this does to the service industry is bad enough, but what it's doing to workers like myself is devastating. Our opportunity to maximize our income under a traditional tipping structure is being stripped away. And this pushes tipped workers closer to making minimum wage while raising the cost of living for all of us. Cutting hours forces us to take on 2 or more jobs just to work enough to earn a paycheck. And the elimination of jobs means more people are vying for fewer and fewer opportunities to work. The minimum wage hike in Seattle has created instability for workers, and it's especially true since the COVID pandemic. With every next wage hike, one more shift gets cut, one less guest comes in, and another job opportunity dries up. Since the pandemic, I have yet to find my footing in the industry that I've always found stability in. The industry that helped me go to school, raise a child, and pursue my passions seems to have become unreliable, unsettled, and unbalanced. These wage hikes are negatively affecting non-tipped workers as well. My friend works for a major produce provider in Seattle, and he explained to me that his company is now pivoting to providing pre-prepped vegetables to restaurants because those restaurants can no longer afford to employ a prep cook. What's about to happen in Seattle with the next wage hike has been described by our small business owners as a wipeout. When they raise the wage again, the total compensation credit that was built into the wage hike for our smallest businesses is set to expire. They will now be required to pay the same that all the larger employers pay. Their labor will go from $17.25 an hour to north of $20 an hour on January 1st. And last week, our local industry leaders held a town hall. They mentioned that because of this impending wage hike on January 1st, menu prices would need to increase, pay structures would have to change, and business models would need to adapt. And all of this will result in labor costs being passed on to customers, while workers like myself will bear the brunt, facing the potential elimination of tips and a predicted wave of layoffs. So things are not so great in Seattle. And I would dare any economist here to keep an eye on what's happening in my city, my home. Watch the business closures. Look at how many jobs we have to have. Measure how the cost of living goes up every time that wage goes up. And you tell me how this is helping me and workers like me, because I can't. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for your testimony. Under Committee Rule 9, we will now question witnesses under the 5-minute rule. The representative from Missouri, Mr. Burleson, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Ms. Barron. I found your testimony to be very compelling, particularly because you're living it. Often you have people up here talking about how you and other tipped workers what you should believe and what you should think. I would think that would be very demeaning and belittling to have someone, someone telling you that you just don't know what you're talking about. What's best for you?
Absolutely. One of the things that is really sort of just completely weird to me is that we have Ms. Jayaraman representing voices of the restaurant industry. As far as I'm concerned, Ms. Jayaraman's a labor activist from Berkeley. She's not worked in the restaurant industry. She's not an industry worker. She's not walked a mile in my shoes. For her to claim that she's the voice of restaurant workers like myself, I don't get it. And most of the people that I know in the restaurant industry don't even know who she is and how she can be a voice for lifting workers. I don't know how that can happen. It doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, it seemed that there's a lack of understanding of basic economics and the results of some of these decisions that are made. But you don't have to have an economics degree because you're experiencing it firsthand.
Yeah, yes, I'm experiencing it firsthand. I mean, I live it every day. I see it every day. I live in Seattle where these policies have absolutely devastated us, and more is coming. And all my friends work in the industry, and the stories that we get every day, that I get every day. Oh, Simone, you know what? I have to get another job. Why? Oh, well, they just cut all of our shifts. Me personally, I'm affected as well. My shifts have been cut now from 4 to 5 shifts a week down to 2, and maybe 1 a week if I'm lucky, and that's because this impending hike that's coming on January 1. And I'm not the only one.
Right, because if you require the employers to pay more and you eliminate the tipped credit, then the only way to accomplish that is to cut hours, right? Cut staff.
Yeah.
So you have fewer people working and providing services. It's more expensive for those to pay those people, and the costs of everything goes up. So that you have fewer people working, and everybody's having to pay more.
Exactly. And one of the biggest things, the first thing that always happens is the support staff gets cut. And so we're talking about entry-level jobs here. Those are usually entry-level jobs into the restaurant industry. Those are your bussers, your service assistants. Those tend to be people of color, if you want to talk about it that way. People who are just starting out in the industry, maybe this is their first job in America even. But those jobs are getting cut. They're just getting cut.
Can you talk or touch a little bit upon, I'm sure you've seen the proposed change to eliminate the taxes on tips.
Yeah.
And how that is actually going in the opposite direction. To me, this is a war against tipped workers, but I think that this proposed change by the Trump administration might actually, you could respond to what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I don't know how they're going to work out no tax on tips. I think it's fantastic, though. And the reason why I'm saying, if we're sitting here talking about we want, higher wages, even if we have a higher wage, like $17 or more in Seattle, if I'm working in a restaurant that's really, really booming and I make a lot of tips one week, all of the taxes come out of that paycheck. I worked over Mother's Day weekend. I made a lot of tips. even though I had that higher wage, my wage paycheck was only $25. So to me, it's not about the wages, the flat wage that I'm getting. It's about the tips that I'm getting. And then if we have no tax on that, then I guess then I would maybe benefit a little bit from having a higher wage, but it's all about the tipping. It's all about the tipping.
Mr. Boucher, can you touch on the cost of just complying with all the regulations, the burden of that and the impact on your businesses?
Yeah, sure. You know, I've actually done the calculus a number of times over the years, and I think you alluded to this, that there's no question that we would have to cut staff and increase prices. And in our business model, we operate on a three-legged stool approach to decision-making. We make decisions what's best for the employee, what's best for the customer, and what's best for the business. And they all have to balance that three-legged stool. And in this case, all three lose. All three would lose because we would cut hours, cut staff, guests would get worse service, and the business already operating on 3 to 5 cents of profit of every revenue dollar that comes in would shrink as well. So it would just devastate our business approach of the three-legged stool.
Thank you. My time has expired.
Now I recognize the ranking member, Dr. Adams, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Jayaraman, one of the major differences between Republican and Democratic administrations is the manner in which the focus is placed on how to pay tip workers for time spent on activities for which they cannot earn tips. First, for the benefit of those among us who may not have worked in a full-service restaurant, can you explain what side work is?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, as I mentioned, I represent 300,000 restaurant and service workers. 150,000 petitions from workers were delivered to Congress saying people want a raise, a full minimum wage with tips on top. And part of the reason that they say that, why so many workers have been asking for this, is because there is such a high level of wage theft, the highest level effect of wage theft of any industry. The U.S. Department of Labor has reported an 84% violation rate with regard to employers complying with the rules surrounding the two-tiered wage system. And one of them has to do with side work. The fact that there is plenty of work that tipped workers are asked to do that does not allow them to actually get tips. Rolling napkins, setting up tables, putting ketchup bottles or mustard bottles on a table, condiments, all the things that, wiping glasses, all the things, rolling silverware, all the things that set up a table but don't allow you to interact with guests. And so, you know, it was really very problematic to see rules taken away during the Trump administration, protections taken away for workers doing side work to ensure that while they are doing side work, they are not, you know, being paid continuously a sub-minimum wage. We need to ensure that workers are only doing that for 20% of their time or less, so that most of the time they actually have the ability to get the tips that get them to the full minimum wage.
And so is it correct that time spent on side work is time spent not earning tips?
Not earning tips.
Okay, so walk us through how the 80-20 rule matters for restaurant workers.
Right, so that's what I was saying, that there's a very high level, unfortunately, of wage theft. That means employers engaging in activities that don't allow workers to get the full minimum wage or have their rights protected. And when you have employers having workers do lots of side work, not able to access tips, they then are not able to get enough tips to bring them to the full minimum wage, which is why in our surveys we found 50% of workers saying, I regularly, consistently experience times when tips don't bring me to the full minimum wage and the employer does not make up the difference.
So what was the Trump administration's approach to paying restaurant workers for activities such as side work?
I want to say that the Trump administration's first act coming into office was to push to make tips the property of owners rather than workers, which was the most egregious thing that any administration had ever done to tipped workers. When we want to talk about an attack on tipped workers, the most precious thing tipped workers have is their tips. on top of their wages. And so the fact that the Trump administration tried to make tips the property of owners rather than workers was the first real attack on tipped workers. The second was to remove protections that they had that would allow them to actually earn a full minimum wage with tips. You know, clearly, if an employer is allowed to pay them a sub-minimum wage while doing excessive amounts of side work, they actually cannot then access enough tips to bring them to the full minimum wage.
So, Ms. Jayaraman, what are your thoughts regarding the argument that paying a full minimum wage with tips on top would kill business and reduce tipping?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, there are 7 states that have already require a full minimum wage with tips on top. Our research shows that not only have they consistently had higher small business growth rates, job growth rates, tipping averages than the 43 states, but in fact, during the pandemic, they've much outperformed the 43 states with a sub-minimum wage. More recently, one fair wage, a full minimum wage with tips on top, was passed in Flagstaff, DC, and we are seeing more restaurants, more jobs, and higher wages, including tips.
Okay, so your testimony linked the tip credit and sub-minimum wage for tip workers with discrimination and sexual harassment. So how does the tip credit make that possible?
With an overwhelmingly female population, over 2/3, these workers are vulnerable to harassment from customers in order to have to, feed their families in tips. They have to put up with all kinds of inappropriate customer behavior in order to feed their families in tips, which is why the industry has the highest rates of harassment of any industry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
The representative from Wisconsin, Mr. Grothman, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. First of all, I guess for Mr. Boucher or Mr. DeCamp, I guess part of the debate here today, or what the previous speaker said, kind of implies that people are almost destitute here if they're working as a server or bartender. I've talked to some of the employers in my district, say just with a regular variety sports bar, and even they're amazed at the amount of money that their employees are getting in tips. Could either you give a suggestion as to what either the wait staff or the bartenders are making, say, first of all in general, and secondly on, say, a Friday night?
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer. So, as I mentioned in my testimony, our servers earn between $20 and $35 an hour when you include their hourly wage plus tips. And in fact, we at times are challenged with trying to promote a tipped employee into a management position because there are times where they're earning more, especially as you indicate on those busier weekend nights. And our higher end concepts, with the higher check average, they earn a significant amount of income, and it's difficult sometimes to recruit them to want to become a manager.
Do they make more than you guys sometimes?
I'm sorry?
They make more than you guys sometimes? Your managers? I'm sure they do.
That's what I'm saying. There are times, yes.
Yeah. I mean, I was talking to one of my guys recently. His folks are making more than yours, but Mr. DeCamp, you think $25 an hour in tips is it, or some of his people make more than that?
Depends very much on the restaurant, but on average, they're doing very well. And with most of the restaurants that I work with, the front of the house employees, the servers, the bartenders, and whatnot, tend to have total earnings that are well above what the kitchen staff are earning, the cooks, the prep cooks.
Yeah, way more.
Right. Those are the positions that people want in the restaurants because they're lucrative. So the idea that most tipped employees are on the edge of starvation is just wrong. That ignores the economic reality.
Can you give me a crack at what people are making, you think, an hour?
Right. The current economic data that we've seen suggests that the average tipped employee across the United States, between their cash wages and their tips, is earning $15.51 an hour. That's across all restaurant concepts.
Well, you ought to come other places because I think they make more than that, but if that's what you think. According to the National Restaurant Association, tip workers earn a median wage of nearly 4 times the current federal minimum wage. Can you discuss the earnings? Well, we kind of covered that. How high? I'm sorry. How high do you think people get in your restaurant if the better people work a little bit harder? What do you think they can work their way up to hourly?
I mean, as I said, there are times where I've seen, I'll just give you the number. We have employees that make between $75,000 and $100,000 a year in a tipped capacity.
Right, that's what I thought. You can do that. Not maybe at a base place, but
Yes.
a little nicer than average, a particularly busy place. I'll ask you here now, if you have a detailed breakdown as to what an average day would look like with you tracking the hours of your tipped employees, should the 30 continuous minute rule be finalized, do you want to give this idea of the amount of paperwork that is going to have to go into that?
You're talking about the 80/20?
Right.
It's impossible. It's impossible to track. And we did it as best as we could, but I would have to hire someone literally to stand there and keep track of every 2 minutes someone is rolling silverware, as she indicated, and I would argue that these other tasks that are being done, that's part of the service that they're giving the customer. If they're not rolling silverware for that guest, they're just throwing silverware and napkin on a table. That's not exactly what our guests want. So I would argue that these other non-tipped timing is all part of the guest experience.
I'll give you one other question, and these are great jobs. Like many people, I worked in a service business when my first jobs were out there. But could you let us know when you're hiring somebody how much training or that sort of thing goes into before you allow them to become wait staff?
Yeah, our servers are trained for at least 7 shifts, depending on their experience, sometimes 10, and they are paid minimum wage for those shifts.
Okay, so within 2 weeks, you can take the job. I mean, I guess we compare it to other jobs, you know, maybe get a tech school degree, maybe be an apprentice for a couple of years. Within 2 weeks, if I apply to your place to be wait staff, 2 weeks from now, I could be making, you know, the $25.
$25 an hour, yes. And in some cases, that's people with no experience at all.
Right, you can have an 18-year-old just hired like that.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
The representative from California, Mr. Takano, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the witnesses for being here today. The title of this hearing, Examining the Biden-Harris Attacks on Tipped Workers, makes it obvious that my colleagues across the aisle would like to frame their agenda as pro-worker. There is nothing pro-worker about advocating for the continuation of a sub-minimum wage. The two-tier wage system that tipped credits have created costs workers billions of dollars a year in wage theft, and employer violations of regulations designed to protect tipped workers occurs at alarmingly high rates. And while there are many employers who ensure that their employees are being fairly paid, unscrupulous employers who seek to save on labor costs or skim off the top of earned tips are costing American workers their livelihoods. Too many tipped workers in this country are unable to make a sustainable living. So, Ms. Jayaraman, approximately 5.1% of all workers live in poverty, but for tipped workers, the share is much higher, 11.3%. What role does the tipped credit play in pushing workers into poverty?
So I would challenge anybody here, any of you Congress members, to try to live on $2.13 an hour, with the bulk of your income coming from tips from your constituents, depending on whether they like your smile, or they like the way you behave, or your body, or whether you let them touch you, which is the reality for the overwhelming majority of tipped workers in the United States, who are overwhelmingly women, disproportionately women of color. We have the highest rates of single mothers of any occupation, having to put up with all kinds of inappropriate behavior from customers in order to feed their children in tips. Why are they at more than twice the rate of poverty of other workers? It is because tips are unreliable. Tips go up, they go up and down shift to shift, week to week, season to season, month to month, but your rent and your bills do not go up and down every week, month, season to season. And so the instability of tips is why so many workers find quite often their tips do not bring them to the full minimum wage. In fact, as I said, 50% of workers say regularly they experience sometimes tips not bringing them to the full minimum wage. and the employer not making up the difference because, as the U.S. Department of Labor found, an 84% violation rate with regard to employers complying with these rules. So the combination of the ridiculously low wage, the instability of tips, and the non-compliance with these rules results in workers earning too little to feed their families, which is why the people who feed us use food stamps at double the rate of other workers.
Well, so thank you so much for that. This tip credit system also means that employers are relying on customers, as you said, to make up the full employee's wage, and they often don't get to even the federal minimum. You already described how the model puts at risk workers in the workplace, and you alluded to specifically discrimination and harassment. That's what tipped workers often have to endure in their jobs. Is that right?
That's right. Professor Catherine McKinnon, who's the nation's leading scholar on sexual harassment, coined the term sexual harassment, has said that the restaurant industry, and tipped workers in particular, have the highest rates of sexual harassment of any industry because they have to rely on unstable tips and the biases and harassment of customers in order to get those tips. She also has said that there is no policy she has seen in her decades of work on this issue more effective at cutting sexual harassment than actually providing these workers with a full minimum wage with tips on top. It got worse with the pandemic. Thousands of women reported to us. I'm regularly asked, take off your mask so I can see how cute you are before I decide how much to tip you. That was so pervasive, we ended up working with Professor McKinnon to coin a new term, masculine harassment.
That strikes me as so humiliating and undignified for any human being who does not have the right to a full minimum wage and has to, this sort of leverage over them to permit that harassment. The trouble that it would take to stand up to that when they are on the verge, when they are in poverty. Some opponents of paying tip workers the full minimum wage claim that tip workers do not want a full minimum wage with tips on top. What evidence do you have to the contrary?
147,000 petitions to Congress and 1.2 million workers who walked off the job saying we no longer can put up with these wages.
Thank you, and I yield back.
The representative from Illinois, Ms. Miller, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Mr. Boucher, how do you think a policy to end taxes on tips would help your employees, and would that be a positive incentive for restaurant workers?
You know, I think this is a flash in the pan political moment discussing that. It's something that I can't even wrap my head around how that would even play out in the tax code, and so I really don't have an opinion on that issue because I do feel it's a political statement currently because of the election that's coming up.
Certainly it would help the employees, though.
I would think so, but there's always going to be ways around that, and I think, you know, where's the federal government going to get the money to reconcile all those taxes that aren't going to come in?
Well, I want to thank you for creating small businesses that provide jobs and benefit local communities. I'm sorry that DC bureaucrats continue to think that they know how to run your business better than you do, especially after all the damage that they did to Main Street during COVID. Thank you, and I yield back.
The ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Scott, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Jaraman, you've indicated that eliminating the tip credit and the subminimum wage would not reduce tips and would not have an effect on employment or business. You have research to show that?
Absolutely. As I said, we have years of research showing that the 7 states compared to the 43 states have the same or higher small business growth rates, establishment growth rates, job growth rates, and tipping averages. But we have a new report today showing that over the last couple of years since the pandemic, the 7 states have actually outpaced the 43 states with higher establishment growth rates, higher employment growth rates, and higher overall incomes, including tips, compared to the 43 states with the subminimum wage. So since the pandemic, we're seeing the gap between the 7 and the 43 grow, with the 7 states providing a full minimum wage doing better.
Thank you. And could you provide that research for us?
On the record, yes.
Thank you. Eliminating the tipped credit, how would that make life better for workers rather than increasing the, just increasing the minimum wage, eliminating the tip credit? What effect would that actually have on workers?
Yeah, so since we're seeing so much evidence that the states that have a full minimum wage with tips on top are doing better in terms of, as I said, job growth, establishment growth. We know that workers would have the ability to grow in the industry, but most importantly, they would have the stability, economic stability, that they're not allowed in the states that provide a sub-minimum wage. So in sub-minimum wage states, workers have to rely on tips that fluctuate to get them to the base wage or higher. That, as I said, changes day to day, month to month, week to week, shift to shift. A breakfast shift, you get a lot less in tips than a dinner shift. And so the instability of having to rely and the stress of having to not know what you're going to earn when you go to work is the major difference. Knowing what you're going to earn, what you can count on from your employer, then gives you the confidence to reject harassment. And that is why we are seeing that the 7 states with a full minimum wage with tips on top have 1/2 the level of sexual harassment as the states that have a sub-minimum wage. Why? Because workers in those states tell us we can count on a wage from our boss. We're not as reliant on customers to feed our families, so we get tips, but we don't have to put up with anything and everything from customers because we have that base wage.
Now, you mentioned schemes that could result in wage theft because of side work. Are there other schemes where you can essentially steal the workers' tips?
The biggest problem we hear from workers is, as I said, they regularly work shifts where their tips don't bring them to the full minimum wage and the employer doesn't make up the difference. That is one. The second thing we hear a lot about is people who are not supposed to be in the tip pool, whether they are managers or non-tip staff in the tip pool, reducing the amount of tips that workers are receiving. The third thing we hear is, I am asked to do work that is not tipped work, and I'm paid a sub-minimum wage. And I do want to point out, Darden is the world's largest employer of tipped workers, U.S. largest employer of tipped workers, world's largest full-service restaurant company. A few years ago, in their shareholder report, they actually announced to shareholders that they would be trying to move to have all their workers earn a sub-minimum wage, regardless of what they do. And so it is clear that as long as there is a sub-minimum wage, there's an incentive for employers to have workers do all kinds of work, whether it's side work, or it's cleaning bathrooms, or it's back-of-house work, and try to be able to pay them the sub-minimum wage. That is why we need protections for workers who earn a sub-minimum wage, that most of the time they are tipped workers earning tips.
Well, if the protection would be if you get caught, you have a penalty. What are the penalties sufficient?
The penalties are non-existent, and most employers end up, fighting these kind of charges for years. By the time that a worker may even see some kind of restitution of their wages, it's years later. The amount of money has generally very much decreased. They're settling for something a lot less than what they're owed. And so no, employers don't have any real incentive to follow the law because they can delay payment for so long.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous request that the Democratic staff document called A Slap on the Wrist, How It Pays for Unscrupulous Employers to Take Advantage of Workers, a document that was developed by the Democratic staff, be entered into the record.
Without objection. The chairwoman of the full committee, Dr. Fox, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today. Ms. Barron, critics of the tip credit sometimes refer to it as a sub-minimum wage. Do you believe it's a fair characteristic of the wages earned by tip workers?
No, I don't think it is a fair description of that at all. I believe a tip credit is a tool. It's a mutually beneficial economic tool that's used to keep a restaurant sustainable, to keep tipped workers making high above the minimum wage, and keep back of the house workers making competitive wages. That is what a tip credit is. It's not a sub-minimum wage. It is an economic tool. I'm a restaurant worker. How do I know this and nobody else does?
Thank you. As someone who waited tables all through high school and college, I worked hard for my tips, and I was very glad to get them. Mr. Boucher, I understand you've been both a restaurant worker and a business owner in the state of New Hampshire, where employers may utilize the tip credit. What are the benefits of being able to utilize the tip credit, and what might it mean for your business if that option were eliminated?
First, it allows employees that are tipped to, we actually phrase it this way, they're actually kind of running their own business in their section, right? If you have 4 tables, you have the ability to earn as much or as little as you want based on your service, based on how well you're taking care of the guest. And so by eliminating that, they may not be as incentivized to work, as you just indicated, as hard as you did. And secondly, I've already said the economics of it would be devastating for our company.
Well, thank you very much. Again, I've always thought that being able to tip people was a sign of good service or not so good service. And as I see tipped workers as entrepreneurs, basically, they're able to really, really make a difference to their customers. Mr. DeCamp, the Fifth Circuit recently vacated the Biden-Harris administration's 2021 tip regulations. This is the first time a court has scrutinized the Labor Department rule since the Supreme Court overturned Chevron deference. Can you explain why the Fifth Circuit had concerns with the 80-20-30 standard in the Biden-Harris rule?
To put it very succinctly, the court concluded that the department's 80-20-30 regulation was not based on the text of the statute. The statute defines tipped employees a certain way by reference to their occupation and their tips. And what the Department of Labor did was something completely different. Based it on the timesheet and based it on tasks. And what the court said was that Congress never authorized the department to micromanage the activity of restaurant work at that level. It's simply a minimum wage statute.
Well, we've seen throughout the time of the Biden-Harris administration that it oversteps its bounds all of the time. It would like to be all 3 branches of government. It fails often to administer the law as we write it here in Congress. And it's unfortunate we have to rely so much on the courts to remind the administration that it is the executive branch and it's its role to administer the laws, not make the laws. Again, I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today and shedding light on this very important subject. And I thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you need my time, I yield it back to you. If not, I yield.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fox. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ms. Barron, you've worked as a tip worker in Seattle and in Washington State, where they eliminated the tip credits. You've gotten something of a preview of where this new rule from this administration would take us. In your experience, would you say that your fellow tipped workers, that they prefer the tipped system?
Absolutely. They prefer tips over a flat wage. Tips provide us the opportunity to maximize our income and make more than any employer is either willing or can afford to pay. And so why wouldn't we want to do that?
Yeah, well said. And you say in your testimony here that with the elimination of the tip credit, workers like myself have been subject to surcharges, service changes, non-transparent pay models, elimination of tip lines, elimination of tipping. I mean, for all the millions of tip workers across America, with this new rule, do you think it would be fair to say that they're coming after your tips, that bureaucrats in Washington, D.C. are coming after your tips?
Absolutely, and I'll give you an example, and that's the tip pooling rule. The one that Patty Murray changed, the Federal Labor Standards Act language that allows employers to take our tips, if you want to talk about wage theft, an opportunity to wage theft, to take our tips, so that they can pay back of the house workers or non-tipped workers because they can't afford to pay the high wages. They can't afford to keep back of the house wages competitive. So now we have in all the one fair wage states this tip pooling rule that allows the employers to take our tips and pay non-tipped employees. And that is, it's ludicrous. We're making a lot less money.
Thank you very much. I think that's an important takeaway from this hearing, is that they are coming after your tips. Bureaucrats in
Just
Washington,
like Trump
D.C.
did, right?
Trump didn't do that. Patty Murray did that. And
Excuse
you
me.
did too.
I wasn't speaking to you, Ms. Jamarm. Okay, Mr. Boucher, you're a restaurant owner, is that correct?
I am.
And you testified that you've actually seen examples of restaurants closing down altogether because of the elimination of tipping. Can you explain a little bit about the cause and effect there?
Sure. So there were two restaurants in New Hampshire. I won't name them right now, but they went to that model where they paid their employees a flat wage, and they had it on their menus that customers did not have to tip, and that was reflective in their pricing of the menu. And it resulted in these employees, they didn't last. One restaurant, I think, closed in 6 months, and one didn't even last a year. Because these employees, think about it. You want to work Saturday night for $15 an hour, or would you rather work Monday lunch for $15 an hour? So what happened was these employees said, you know what? I'm going to work $15 an hour at lunch for this restaurant. I'm going to get a tipped job at this other restaurant. And so they eventually lost all their employees because they could make more in a tip wage environment.
Yeah, and we've seen this in California with the COVID shutdowns, and other very bad policies have caused restaurants to shut down. And in that case, it hurts not just the workers, but you have families who save money to go to their favorite restaurant once a month. It's not there anymore. You have couples who go there every year on their anniversary. You have folks who, they're one night out a week, they like to go to this place with their friends. Suddenly it's not there. So I think that's another takeaway from this hearing, is that the bureaucrats in DC are coming after your favorite restaurant. Now, of course, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush when it comes to folks at the Department of Labor, because we have Mr. DeCamp here, who was the administrator of the Wage and Hour Division, and had a very different set of priorities when he was there. And I think one of the things you mentioned in your testimony is that surveys actually show overwhelmingly that workers prefer the tip model, right?
Well, that's correct. I mean, I think everybody would like to have their cake and eat it too, and have a very high cash wage and keep all their tips, but that's not the reality. When faced with the practical reality of either a cash wage plus, at a sub-minimum wage plus tips, or a higher flat wage, workers overwhelmingly want the opportunity to get tips.
Yeah, it's like set 90% or something like that.
97 is the research I've seen.
Yeah, and it's interesting. We saw similar numbers with another policy that's been fiated by the Department of Labor, the independent contractor rule, where they want to force people out of the independent contractor model, even though 90% prefer that model. Now they want to force people, take away their tips, even though 90% say they prefer getting tips. What do you think is going on here? I mean, you were in charge of the Wage and Hour Division there. There's new leadership now, and they're consistently enacting policies without involving Congress that specifically do exactly the opposite of what workers want. What do you think is behind all this?
I think it's bureaucratic arrogance. Agencies get used to the courts rubber stamping what they do. I think that's going to change now that Chevron has been overruled, and I think that agencies are going to be held more strictly accountable to adhering to the laws that Congress enacts.
Thanks very much. My time has expired, and I will now recognize the representative from Utah, Mr. Owens, for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And thank you guys for being here. I want to start off with Ms. Jarman.
Jayaraman.
Thank you. Sorry about that. Okay.
That's okay.
I noticed the passion as you were talking about the changes the Trump administration made when coming in. I guess my first question, I looked at your background, very impressive, BA from University of California, GD from Yale Law University. How much time have you spent as a tip worker?
So I represent 300,000 workers.
No. I have
I
a
myself,
very specific.
my family-owned restaurants.
That's not my question. How much time have you spent as a tip worker, you personally?
I have not been a tipped worker.
Okay, thank you. How much time have you spent as a owner?
I've spent 10 years as an
No, in other words, you have
As a restaurant owner, I
your
spent 10 years.
family or you?
Me. Our organization had a restaurant.
All right, organization or you? I'm talking about a small business owner now. There's a difference in organization.
So I started an organization. Our organization opened 3 restaurants.
Did you actually open them yourself, or your organization opened it?
As the president of the organization, I opened the restaurants.
Okay. I think there's a difference in your concept of ownership than Mr. Brockman here.
I
So,
don't think so, because I started them, I hired people, I did
Well,
all the same things that an
okay,
employer
well,
did. Yeah.
I'll say this, because you're sitting next to a tip worker, and it seems to be a disconnect to me. You're very confident as you listen to somebody who's telling you you're destroying her
Because-
business. Now, can I ask you this? You're making now I'm sure, a very high six-figure income. Does your income change when Cracker Barrel, Chili's, Applebee's, Mod Pizza, Red Lobster, TGI, these are all companies that have left California because of the tip law? There's 10,000 people have lost their jobs from September to January because of this mandatory tip law. Does your income change if you get it wrong?
That doesn't make any sense, because California has
No,
had
no.
a full minimum wage with tips on
No.
top for
I'm-
over 50 years.
No, well,
So it doesn't make sense for businesses to have left in the last couple of months.
I reclaim my time.
It doesn't have anything to do with that.
Well, it does.
Yeah.
A $20 minimum wage just happened. It's like,
Right,
let me
but that's
just
not
finish.
what
Let me
we're talking
finish.
about
Let me
today.
The direct impact of a $20 minimum wage has been these companies leaving California. The ones you just highlighted as being such a great place to be. 10,000 people have lost their jobs. How many of those 10,000 because of the $20 minimum wage? Because bureaucrats have decided how this industry should work.
So none of those jobs
I have a question. I have a
or
question. I have a
businesses are
question.
tipped workers or tipped employees.
We're talking
If you
about-
look at Denny's, which is a very large employer of tipped
I want
workers,
to
the
take back and
CFO
reclaim
of
my time.
Denny's
I want to
has
reclaim my time.
has
I'm gonna reclaim
indicated
my
that
time,
Denny's
please.
is growing faster in California than any state in the United
As-
States
oh.
because they pay their people a full
Just
minimum
because you
wage.
say so doesn't mean it's so, okay? Now, if I played in the NFL for 10 years, have you ever played in the NFL, by the way?
Have I ever played in the NFL? No, I
Okay,
have not.
Okay.
Probably because of
what would you
sexism.
say? What would you say if you're given a position to make rules in the NFL that you never had to live by? Would that be? Would you even give yourself a good name? I mean, you give yourself a title, good income. Would we take you seriously if we were talking about rules and changes in the NFL if you've never had experience in that area?
Sir,
the answer is no.
I have been working with restaurant workers for the last 30 years.
Well, you're sitting
Hundreds
next
of
to
thousands of restaurant
you're sitting
workers
next to restaurant people
who
right
have,
now.
Yes,
who's
restaurant
impacted.
workers,
We're
like
looking
all
at-
people, can have differences of opinions. The overwhelming majority of workers in this industry say we need a raise. We are not paid enough. Because, as I said, I would
let me-
challenge any of you to
sorry,
live
I'd
on
like to take back my
$2.
time,
I would
please.
challenge
I'd like
Ms. Barron to
okay,
live on
all right,
$2
well, you know
right
what?
now, to
The
leave
good thing
Seattle
about-
and go work for
I'd like to reclaim
$2
my
right
time,
now.
please. I'd like to reclaim. The great thing about this great country is choice.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of saying, we have people like the young lady here who can leave and go to another industry. You know that, right?
Or go to another state. Yes, absolutely.
Well, if they're leaving California, so obviously it's not working there. They're leaving Seattle because it's not working there.
California has the
unfortunately,
largest and
the sad
fastest
part of
growing
it-
restaurant
the
industry
sad
in the
part of
country.
this conversation is bureaucrats, arrogant bureaucrats who sit there and make these rules, have no idea, and you're sitting next to someone who's been impacted.
Well,
10 years in this industry.
The
and
worst
she's telling
rule
you, and she's
was the
telling
Trump
you,
administration
she's telling you what
trying
it's
to
doing
make
to her.
tips the property of
She's telling you
owners
what she's
rather
trying
than
to do,
workers.
what's happening to her family, and you're sitting there with a little smile on your face because it doesn't matter to you. You're going to make your income no matter what. The problem is we
No.
have too many bureaucrats who sit there with expertise and just. Right now, California is being destroyed, by the way, because of these kind of rules.
California
As
has
you
the
highlighted.
largest and fastest
That's
growing
why- that's
restaurant
why so
industry
many
in the
people-
United States, according to the
That's why
CFO of
there's
Denny's.
That's why we're leaving California sound all over the place because of the great things
All
they're
the
doing there.
chains have grown faster in California than any state in the U.S.,
Well,
according to the CFO
Do
of
me
Denny's.
a favor, keep it in California then. Thank you so much. You're back my time.
I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony, and I now recognize the ranking member for a closing statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the witnesses as well, but Congress is a good example of the fact that we make rules, and sometimes we don't know a lot about what people are going through. So, maybe we are in that sense. We don't know what we don't know as well. But I do appreciate what has been said here today. The current subminimum wage for tipped employees perpetuates low pay, enables inexcusable levels of wage theft, and it leads to higher poverty rates. Despite some high earning expectations, most tip workers face income insecurity and limited or no access to benefits. The Trump administration's attempt to gut protections for tip workers would have only worsened these issues by allowing employers to steal almost $6 billion of workers' hard-earned tips for themselves each year. Luckily, in 2021, the Biden-Harris administration withdrew the Trump administration's extreme attack on tip workers by ensuring workers, not their bosses, get workers' tips. And so it's abundantly clear that there are two agendas present today. The Republicans' agenda will weaken worker protections and let low-road employers off the hook for breaking the law. And while the Democratic agenda is focused on uplifting workers by advancing legislation like the Raise the Wage Act and the Let's Protect Workers Act, which will secure fair wages, close loopholes, and hold dishonest employers accountable. So let's work together to build a system that supports all workers and addresses these pressing issues. I thank the witnesses very much for being here today, for your testimony. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. I think this hearing has brought to light some important implications of the current policy. Well, the policy that's no longer in effect because it was struck down by a court, but clearly the direction that this administration wants to take us. That for millions of Americans who rely on tips, who are proud of the tips they earned, who appreciate the opportunity to earn tips and depend on them for their livelihood, you have a Department of Labor in this Biden-Harris administration under the direction of unconfirmed Acting Secretary Julie Su that is coming after your tips simply by issuing regulations. And I think that's a very alarming thing, and the contrast could not be clearer, because we have legislation right now in Congress that would actually say you get to keep your tips entirely, no taxes on tips. The contrast couldn't be clearer between that and saying we don't want you to have any tips at all. And then we also saw that for the folks who run restaurants, this could be a very challenging industry, especially in recent years. This is really a threat to the viability of a lot of restaurants. And so they're coming after your favorite restaurant as well. And coming from California, we've gotten something of a preview of this set of policies. After all, the current acting secretary, Ms. Su, was the Department of Labor head in California. And under her leadership in the Newsom administration, California, for most of her tenure, had the highest unemployment rate in the entire country. We had the slowest level of wage growth, absolute last out of the 50 states. We also had the highest poverty rate in the United States. And so her record there was so bad that even a majority of her own party in the Senate refused to confirm her. Now, that was no matter to the Biden administration. They've decided to keep her there without a vote, shattering all records for an unconfirmed acting secretary remaining in office. And the vice president, Kamala Harris, even went so far as to say, I'm not going to call her acting, even though the Senate refused to confirm her. Vice President Harris, sitting vice president of the United States, basically shoves the Constitution aside, says, I'm not going to call her acting. And so she's remained there and has continued to promulgate these anti-worker policies. And I think that a common thread, as we discussed, between this and, say, the independent contractor rule, is these rules, by force, run directly against the wishes of workers. 90% prefer the tip model. Similar numbers of independent contractors prefer to be independent contractors, and yet they want to issue orders without so much as a vote of Congress that say, we're going to take away your tips, we're going to take away your right to earn a living on your own terms. Fortunately, under the leadership of Dr. Fox, this committee, Education and the Workforce, is fighting back against these overreaching regulations. We just had a good court ruling on the tipping rule. The independent contractor rule is being challenged in court as well, and we will continue to fight to protect workers and small businesses. With that, and seeing without objection, there being no further business, the subcommittee stands adjourned.